to England now, where almost all coronavirus restrictions have now been lifted. For more, British broadcaster and commentator Jonathan Sacerdoti joined me from London.
Well, it's quite hard to know who came up with this Freedom Day moniker. And I think it's been annoying quite a lot of us because it's a pretty daft name for it. And that's really because we haven't beaten the pandemic, and most of the world hasn't beaten the pandemic. So I think talking about freedom from it is really getting things a bit wrong. In reality, what's happened is that the last remaining rules, which could be considered part of a lockdown, have been lifted, and the obligation to wear masks, for example, has also been lifted. But I think that as the day has approached, there's been really a lot of pressure on the government to change their minds or to reel it in a bit. And that's been quite interesting as well, because there's obviously a large part of society that really wanted this and were pushing for it to happen. But then there's quite a large part of society as well, which is incredibly nervous. So somebody said to me today, it's as if all the people who haven't been obeying the rules anyway just feel vindicated now, and everyone else has gone into hiding. And I think it's unfortunate if that is what's happened. But for example, last night, nightclubs opened for the first time on the stroke of midnight, and there were queues of young people in particular queuing up to go into them. Some of them had never been to a nightclub before because they kind of came of age during this COVID era. And so all of those things are quite interesting to see. And without an obligation to wear masks, people are being advised to or recommended that they should. But now it's down to everybody's individual choice what they do.
Fair to say, as you've flagged there, the COVID crisis is far from over in the UK and in other parts of the world as well. Can you give us a sense of the numbers that you are seeing there at the moment when it comes to new infections?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, infections are increasing. And in the government press statement today, the televised press conference that they do, they showed you the graphs. You know, there were 39,950 new cases in the last 24 hours, 19 new deaths. And that brings to the total 128,727 deaths within 28 days of a positive COVID test. So these are still quite worrying numbers. But what they were pointing out in the press conference is that while the cases are rising at this quite alarming rate and doubling every, I think it was 11 days, they said, the same rise is not seen in terms of hospitalizations or indeed deaths. And so they see that as a sign that the vaccines are working, if not stopping people actually getting COVID, they think, stopping them getting seriously ill and stopping people from dying in the same numbers. So when they overlaid the graphs from the last peak and this peak, they showed that really we're kind of on a par with the last peak in terms of infection numbers, but we're not seeing the same peak in terms of hospitalization and deaths. Interestingly, the people that they're most worried about at this stage are younger people. And a third of young people between 18 and 30 have still not had a vaccine, even though they're now being offered them. And so I think that the interesting thing that they announced today, other than the lifting of rules, was what will happen sometime in September. Boris Johnson said that by then, all 18 and above year olds will have had the opportunity not just to get a vaccine, but to have had both doses. And because that's the case, it's not obligatory to have them, but he said that at that point, nightclubs and other crowded venues will be able to refuse entry to people who haven't had both doses. And he said they may even make that mandatory if they need to, which means that it's a really strong incentive. They're trying to incentivize younger people now.
Okay. And look, as you say, a bit of a divide amongst health experts. We've also heard concerns from the opposition Labor Party as well about whether it was the right time to open up. But this, of course, comes as the Prime Minister himself is in isolation. Has the fallout continued from this twist in the tail?
Yeah, absolutely it has. And what happened, I mean, it's like something of a disaster movie. I mean, every day of the COVID pandemic for all of us around the world has been like living in a movie. But it's all too real, sadly. And what happened over the last few days was just fascinating. First, the new health minister, who was only recently put into the post after his predecessor was caught on CCTV that was leaked to the press embracing one of his aides. So not only having an extramarital affair, but also breaking the social distancing rules he'd put in place. He was replaced by Sajid Javid, the new health minister, who on Friday apparently felt groggy, had a COVID test and tested positive. So having had meetings that same day with the Prime Minister Boris Johnson and with the Chancellor of the Exchequer Rishi Sunak, they of course were contacts. Now, they then announced that they actually weren't going to go into isolation, which is the rule for people who are contacted and told they've been in contact with someone who tested positive. They were instead going to take part in a National Health Service pilot study where they would test every day in order to be able to keep going to work. Of course, you can imagine how that went down the day before this so-called Freedom Day, when the country was being unlocked, the rules were being lifted, but everyone was being told that if they get contacted by the track and trace, they must isolate. It becomes even more important now the restrictions are being lifted. And then the day before it, the Prime Minister and the Chancellor both said they weren't going to. So they performed the quickest U-turn probably in history. And in about 2 hours, they backed off, said they will be isolating. They are now isolating. It was a bit of a shame that they didn't use that opportunity originally to really give an example to the nation that that's what everyone's going to have to do. And today in the press conference, Boris Johnson reiterated that they're not really lifting those restrictions for many people. And they're making it easier for very, very few essential workers to do what they were going to try and do, this testing every day. But everyone else, he said, just has to go into isolation.
That's British broadcaster and commentator Jonathan Sacerdoti on Freedom Day. Most coronavirus restrictions being lifted in England.